Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you on Pride Sunday to the Forum, where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And we're delighted to have with us as a special guest on Pride Sunday, author Jonathan Merritt. But to more fully introduce him, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, the Reverend Zach Niang.
Thanks, Peter. Happy Pride, everyone. Happy Pride! Thanks for braving the crowds and making your way down Park Avenue to be here for our forum, and it is an honor to introduce my friend Jonathan Merritt, one of America's popular writers on issues of faith and culture. Jonathan is author of several books, including Learning to Speak God from Scratch, named Book of the Year by Inglewood Review of Books, and his most recent book, available here in the St. Bart's bookstore and immediately in the Great Hall following the Forum, a children's book, My Guncle and Me. Jonathan is an award-winning contributor for The Atlantic, a contributing editor for The Week, and a regular columnist for Religion News Service. He has published more than 3,000 articles in respected outlets such as The New York Times, USA Today, The Washington Post, and Christianity Today. He holds a Master of Divinity degree from Southeastern Baptist Seminary, a Master of Theology from Emory, and has done additional graduate work focused on theology at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church. Please welcome Jonathan Merritt.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Do you mind if I stand? Can I stand while I speak? Happy Pride to all of you. Thank you so much for having me here at St. Bart's. It's such an honor. You have such a lovely and historic church. I was able to be here during the pandemic, albeit briefly, for a digital forum that we did, but it's good to be with you in an incarnational way in the flesh. And so as we begin this morning, I imagine it will be okay if we begin with a moment of prayer. We are in a church after all. And so if we can maybe just still our spirits and listen to what the Spirit may be stirring in you this Pride Sunday. Come, Holy Spirit, and speak a word to us this day. Make your presence known, because if you are with us, then nothing else matters. And if you are not with us, then nothing else matters. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, for my talk today, I've titled it Following Jesus in an Age of Fear. Fear is something that is swirling about not only our city, but also our world right now. A lot of uncertainty. We're in the midst of perhaps the most contentious election season, certainly of my lifetime, maybe of some of yours. And because we're in a church having this conversation about fear, I wanted to root it not only in my own story, but also in the sacred scriptures. And so I'll begin today by reading a passage that many of you will know. You'll know it because it popped up in the lectionary just a couple of weeks ago. And so I thought about changing this talk when I realized it was in the lectionary, but you know, Jesus talked often about the way that the Spirit plows our hearts and plants seeds and prepares our spirits for great harvest. And so I bring this text this morning trusting that if you were here a few weeks ago, that there was some good work done that week to plow your hearts for what might be a harvest this morning. This passage comes from the Gospel of Luke in the 8th chapter, verses 22 through 25, and it says this. One day Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a storm of wind came down upon the lake. And they were filling with water, and they were in danger, and they went and woke him and said, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. And he said to them, Where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, Who then is this that he commands, even the wind and water, and they obey him? This is the gospel of the Lord. In the 20th century, one of the most influential psychologists in the world was a man named Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman identified 6 basic emotions: anger, disgust, happiness or joy, sadness, surprise, and fear. Maybe some of you have seen Inside Out. But Ekman said that the last one of those emotions, fear, actually turned out to be the most basic. In fact, it's so primitive that even lower life forms, even lizards, seem to feel fear. But even though fear is an emotion, and it's an emotion that we all fear, there's often this sense of shame attached to fear, which is why we camouflage our fears and deny our fears and downplay our fears and hide them from public view. I know a little something about these tactics because I spent the first 3 decades of my life living in the grip of fear and successfully hiding it from nearly everyone I knew. By most American standards, my 20s had been a roaring success. I graduated from college, I earned 2 graduate degrees, I bought my first home, my career was taking off. I wrote and published a couple of books, and I even managed to save enough money to take my dream vacation. On the outside, things seemed perfect. Oh, but underneath that facade was a frightened little boy. Now, if you'd hooked me up to a lie detector test back then, well, then I might have had no choice but to tell you I was gay. I'd known this was true since at least middle school, though I had never had the courage to use that word, even in private. I treated being gay like it was highly classified intel, as if lives depended upon me keeping it secret, and well, at least one life did, mine. But I kept this secret under lock and key, and I had plenty of good reasons to do so. I grew up in the early 1980s, which means I came up in the age of Teddy Ruxpin and Rubik's Cubes, Walkmans and mixtapes, Reading Rainbow and Rainbow Bright. But being born in the 80s also meant I came of age during the height of the American AIDS epidemic. This city knows something of that, I suppose. So as a child, I was inundated with terrible stories, nightmarish stories about what happens to people like me. News outlets showed me clips of emaciated men in hospital beds languishing from a disease they were told was a death sentence. My health class teacher told me awful stories about this so-called gay disease, a death sentence that would be pronounced on any of us kids if we ever dared to come out. And as the middle son of a Southern Baptist preacher, a televangelist, my faith community also told me some things. Abomination was the most electric word I remember, and while I didn't fully understand what it meant at the time, I knew it was an awful thing to be. I had heard stories about what God did to abominations. He sent them to hell, of course. There were also the stories that were told from within. Doomsday scenarios about what would happen if I came out. I rehearsed these more times than I care to recall. I imagined how my family would disown me, how my friends would reject me, how my church would shun me, how I would be totally, utterly alone. If I came out, or if one of the few people who knew decided to push me out, well, I was convinced that I would perish. And so I lived under the tyranny of terror, hamstrung by fear. What are you afraid of? What wakes you up at 4:30 in the morning and makes you walk your dog? When your mind wanders and the voices whisper, what do those voices talk to you about? If you made a list of your most worrisome worries, what would you scribble at the top? And here's a deeper question. Which stories are you telling yourself that are fueling your fears? Well, if even asking these questions raises your blood pressure, then you might want to take a little boat ride with Luke, the Gospeler, across a sea called Galilee. Today's story is a famous one, and we know it must have something important to say to us because 3 of 4 gospel writers made sure to include it in their books, each one putting their own unique spin on the story, but the basic contours are the same. It's immediately obvious that the story is at least partly about fear, but if I asked you to identify where fear shows up in this story, well, I bet you'd point your finger straight at the storm. But the fear-inducing stories in this text are actually flowing long before the first rain cloud even forms. You see, earlier in the chapter, Jesus and his disciples have been crisscrossing the Judean countryside, and the crowd following along has gotten so deep and so dense that even his own mother and brothers can't seem to manage to elbow their ways to the front of the line. Finally, Jesus and his disciples reach the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus decides to charter a boat and cross over to the other side. Now, if you were a religious person living in first century Palestine like Jesus' disciples were, the thought of crossing to the other side of the lake, that would send chills up your spine. That would mean entering the Decapolis, a federation of 10 cities incorporated by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC. They served as outposts of Hellenism and paganism to evangelize the region with Greco-Roman ideals and choke out the Palestinian Jewish culture. A journey to the Decapolis was like a journey to Mordor. No self-respecting Jew would go there. Now, the disciples had grown up hearing stories about this place around campfires and at dinner tables from the rabbis at their synagogue. They'd been warned that the Decapolis was populated with pagan temples consecrated to forbidden idols. It was rumored to be the epicenter of demonic energy, a place where evil spirits roamed about the countryside and possessed passersby. Its residents glorified violence and greed. They practiced child sacrifice. Its farmers raised pigs, an animal that Palestinian Jews considered unclean and most would never have even seen. Every Jewish mother warned her children to avoid the Decapolis at all costs. So when Jesus steps up onto that fishing boat to set sail for this place, the disciples begin to feel the fear rising. Not because they're in any imminent danger, of course, no, but because they are being swept up in a fearful story about what happens to someone who crosses to the other side of the sea. But here's a question. Why would Jesus want to go there anyway? I mean, why would Jesus lead his disciples to a frightening place when he could have chosen any other number of towns to visit? Well, who can say for sure? Not me. But I can tell you a little something about the Christian life. And it's something that almost no one else will tell you when you first sign up for it. Jesus has a habit of leading his disciples to scary places. It happens time and again in the Gospels, and it seems to be true with a lot of his modern disciples as well. And so it seems pretty obvious to me that Jesus wants us to learn to face our fears. And from one angle, that might seem a little bit like spiritual masochism. But from another, it looks like good practice, like preparation. Because, in the end, life will force all of us to go to places that will send shivers up our spines, whether we like it or not. You might find yourself standing in a funeral home of the only lover who ever loved you back. Maybe you'll be asked to clean out the closets in your now vacant childhood home, your parents' house, where you experienced some of your worst traumas. Those of us who live long enough will be wheeled into a nursing home or transferred to an oncology ward or sent to a hospice center. That's just life. Truly, I tell you, Jesus said in John 21, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. So when Jesus stands on this boat and motions for his disciples to join, he's reminding us that we all get to make a choice. We can spend our lives running from our fears, wallpapering over our fears, pretending our fears don't exist. But sooner or later, life will push you into an inescapably frightening place. And those of us who have logged some hours facing our fears will be much better prepared when it does. So somehow in this story, the disciples muster enough nerve to board this boat, and that's when things get even scarier. According to Luke, the ship is sailing across the water, and suddenly, he says, a windstorm came down upon the lake. Now, the wording here sounds a little strange at first when you read it, that is, unless you know a little bit about the region's topography. The Lake of Galilee, as Luke's Gentile readers would have called it, is surrounded by ravine-marked hills that act like wind tunnels, pulling strong winds across the water and stirring up storms. And while the surrounding hills tower at up to 2,000 feet, the sea sits deep down in the valley at nearly 700 feet below sea level. So when strong winds combine with pressure differentials and dramatic temperature drops, it can supercharge a storm. And right on cue, the stories start coming. You see, the storms of Galilee were infamous. Ancient documents and fishing boat charters from this time period include serious warnings about these storms. And the disciples, they're all local to this region, right? Not to mention that 4 of them were actually fishermen. So they're very familiar. They have heard stories about fishing vessels that have capsized, stories about sailors that have drowned. So when the clouds darken and gather, the knots in their stomachs tighten. When the thunder cracks and the rain begins to trickle, their heartbeats quicken. When the winds whip and the lightning strobes, fear steps behind the wheel and the disciples rush to rouse Jesus. Master, Master, they say, we are perishing. We are perishing. The disciples are so confident they're going to die, you wonder why they even bother to wake Jesus up. Let the man sleep if the whole thing's been settled. The disciples say, we are perishing, not we could perish or we might. No, they know exactly where all of this is heading. And that's the thing about fear. Fear is a fortune teller. It's in the business of predicting the future. That's how fear works. That's what fear does. It forecasts the future. And its catastrophic predictions are usually stated with confidence, if not certainty. The disciples are certain they're going to perish, but fear's prediction, as we know, was off. Jesus awakes, and he turns toward that storm, rising to the full height of his being to confront it. And the master stretches out his arms over the water, and the dark storm clouds peel back like the tin top of a sardine can. And there was calm. Fear is a fortune teller, but like most fortune tellers, it's notoriously wrong. According to researchers at Penn State University, only about 8% of the things that people worry about come true. 8%. That means that if you are freaking out right now and catastrophizing about something, the future that you're afraid of is almost certain never to come true. Not in the way you foresee it, not along the timeline that you're predicting, or with the results you expect. When it comes to the way that we humans have evolved to experience of fear, there's a little flaw actually in the system. You see, from the time you were born, you began hearing or overhearing stories from your family, from your church, from your community. And your brain has a way of logging all of these stories. It's sort of a scribe, right? It's writing these stories down, especially the ones that you hear over and over and over. And it creates a kind of library in your head that's stored down in the subconscious. And these stories are kind of like a lens or a matrix through which we see the world. These stories are how we humans make meaning. When you experience fear and it attempts to forecast the future, it's not using a crystal ball or tea leaves. It's using the information that's been collected in your internal story bank in order to make its prediction. You can probably already see the flaws, but there's more. While we are a storytelling species, Reynolds Price once called us Homo narratus, we're also imperfect narrators of our lives. Because there's also something going on inside that head of yours that you probably have heard of, and it's called negativity bias, which is just a fancy word to describe our brain's tendency to hold on to the negative details in stories more easily than the positive or the neutral details. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this is a primal survival instinct meant to keep us alive. But in a world like ours, where we aren't running from saber-toothed tigers, it doesn't always serve us well. So our internal story bank that is skewed toward negativity is helping us to make meaning, which is why fear often overinflates the implications of a threat and also fails to consider conflicting data. Fear will almost always never take into account your strength, your resilience, your endurance, all of these things which often show up in the storm right when you need it. Fear also typically fails to take into account the potential that God's grace and God's presence will actually meet you in your circumstances, which is exactly what happens in today's story. And the disciples, like us, never saw it coming. So they marveled, the text says, saying to one another, "Who then is this that commands even winds and waters, and they obey him?" You know, in the first century, when pagans told stories of nature miracles, they almost always assigned these phenomenon to gods. And the same was true in the ancient Jewish imagination. In the story of Jonah, which is strikingly similar to this one, God stills the storm. And the psalmist lyrically reminds us, it is God that the seas obey. It is God who calms the waves. It is God who guides ships to safe harbor. So when Jesus calms the storm, the disciples realize that their master is more than a mere human performing some magic trick. He is manifesting divine traits. This Jesus that they have been following is the undistilled, undistorted image of God right in their midst. And the light bulbs above their heads begin to illuminate. And they ask a question. Who is this? And now we see a shift in perspective, a new concern, a different primary interest. Do you see it happening in the text? Suddenly, the disciples are less focused on what is happening to them and more concerned about who is happening among them. Let me just speak for myself for a moment. In times of great fear, in times like these, my attention is consumed by the terrible, horrible what. I've lost my job, that's what. My partner packed up and left, that's what. The cancer has come back, that's what. And the scary things in our lives matter. They matter so much. But fear will tell you that they're the only things that matter. And I think Luke, the Gospeler, has come to us in this moment, in this day, on this morning to remind us that there's something else that we must pay attention to in times of great fear, in times like this. Someone else we need to pay attention to. That no matter where we're sailing, God is in the boat. That no matter what we're facing, God is in the storm. That God was on the western shore that felt like home, that you just left behind, and that God is waiting on those eastern shores, that place you never wanted to go. God will be there too when you arrive. The Franciscan author, Father Richard Rohr, reminds us that all spiritual teaching and all spiritual traditions, including Christianity and perhaps especially Buddhism, are trying to teach us to be present to presence, which is to say, to be present to the presence of God. Oh, but the problem is, we're almost always somewhere else. We're either reprocessing the past or we're worrying about the future. But as Father Rohr writes, the presence of God is infinite, everywhere, always and forever. You cannot not be in the presence of God. There's no other place to be. The only change is always on our side. God is present, and we're not present to the presence. If you want to try a spiritual practice during this Pride season, maybe you should try being present to the presence. It's a great practice. And the best part about it is that it can take on so many forms. Sometimes it looks like stillness, just stopping in your tracks and letting this spinning earth do all the work for you. Be still and know that I am God. Sometimes it can look like breathing, just sitting and really centering on your breath, which is your life, which is spirit, breathing the breath that birthed the world. Sometimes it can look like remembering, just setting aside times to recall all the moments that rattled your bones, and yet somehow you found the strength to cope with the unexpected, or you encountered God's grace in the midst of that bygone storm. And if all of this sounds like too much work, well, you can practice the presence by simply opening your eyes, keeping them peeled to what's happening in our midst right now. Right now, the many miracles that are happening in the middle of your storm, present miracles that your past fear never accounted for. Yes, miracles. I know. It's a fraught word for good progressives and modern thinkers like us. Believing in miracles sounds a lot like magical thinking to enlightened minds. The moment I start talking about miracles to most of my friends, I can tell they want to raise their hand and interrupt. They want to tell me they don't believe in miracles, that they've never experienced such things. Oh, but then they start talking about their lives, their actual lives. And it seems pretty clear to me that they have a lot of experience with those sorts of things. They just didn't have a name for what was happening to them, or maybe they called it by another name like coincidence or serendipity or good luck. My friend Eric has been estranged from his mother for nearly 20 years, and he was afraid they'd never reconcile. But recently, he got a text with an apology out of the blue. It's not a solution, but it's a start. A girlfriend of mine got a divorce a few years ago, and she thought it would be the end of her life. But one day she opened the curtains and made her bed and accomplished all sorts of things she never knew she was capable of. My cousin lost his dream job, and then he learned he could live without it. A checkout clerk offers you a needed encouragement. A stranger shows you an uncommon kindness in a time of need. A friend of yours reaches out and gives you a hug in a moment when the thing you need most is human touch. Well, whatever you call them, these kinds of things can peel back the clouds and give you peace. Not just peace from the storm, but peace for the storm. So call them whatever you like. Because the most important thing is not what we name them, but that we notice them. That we attune our awareness to spot them and remember them so that we can remind ourselves of them later. So that we won't forget that they're always happening, even in the middle of storms. Especially in the middle of storms. July of 2012. Just weeks before my 30th birthday. My boat pushed off for the eastern shore, and the bottom fell out of the sky. I was thrust into the place that I feared the most. A former friend of mine, someone I had trusted with so many secrets, publicly outed me for being gay. You know, in many ways, it was just as awful as I expected. My family interactions turned chilly and awkward. I was asked to stand in front of the church where I taught and explain myself. Many of my professional opportunities with Christian organizations, they just dried up. Some of my friends told me they were weirded out and needed some time to process. Most of those never came back. Others were angry and hurt at me, blaming me for not trusting them enough to let them in on my secret. In the aftermath of this trauma, I hated everything. I hated my life, and I hated this body, and I hated all the choices that I had made that put me in this situation to begin with, and I hated the person who'd done this to me. I remember how every night for weeks I would fall into bed already emotionally exhausted, and I would wail until my pillowcase was warm and wet. On those nights I learned that there are so many different kinds of tears. I cried tears of sadness and tears of confusion and tears of rage. And then when I ran out of kinds of tears to cry, I would lay awake pondering the black hole of uncertainty that was my future. You know, I wouldn't wish being outed on my worst enemy. I wouldn't wish it on the evilest person on planet Earth. It split my life open like firewood and set it ablaze. It was awful. And also, I had some conversations that were long overdue. And also, I found the courage to shake loose some words that had been lodged in my throat for years. And also, many of my old friends offered me love and acceptance with no strings attached. And a couple new friends showed up and helped me to take the next labored step. And also, I woke up one morning and I noticed something. That my chest had filled with a sense of new beginning, of new opportunity, of new possibility about what my life could be. And I sat and I felt the love of a God who likes me just the way I am. And I practiced the presence. And that was the moment that I was no longer afraid. I was free. So what do I have to say to you this morning? Well, I can't predict the future, and neither can you. The thing you fear the most may happen, and when it does, there will likely be pain and loss and uncertainty and grief. And also, you may find a strength you didn't know you had, and also unlikely helpers may show up at just the right moment, and also you may learn that you didn't need that thing you lost after all, and also you may find yourself drawn into God's presence and grace and love in a new way. I know that fear's forecast can't often be trusted. I know you're likely stronger than you believe, more resilient than you think, better able to cope than you assume, and I trust, and I trust, and I trust that somewhere in your terrible what, there is an almighty who's working to bring forth marvelous things. Yes, even things that good progressives like us might just call a miracle. Amen and amen.
I think I've found my new favorite homo narratus. Thank you so much, Jonathan. What a wonderfully rich theological exploration you've offered to us on this Pride Sunday. We now have about 15 minutes for questions. Here in the room, Natalie Johnson can take your question cards. And you can also email questions to Peter at pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson @stbarts.org. And immediately following, Tegan is selling copies of My Guncle and Me, Jonathan's new children's book. So get yours afterwards and Jonathan will sign it. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I'm just wondering about how your relationship to church writ large has evolved. Having been brought up to the front of the church to explain yourself, why in the world would you stay in the church to this point? And tell us about that.
You know, I'm asked this question a lot. In fact, I've often thought that my next book should be about why Christians like me are deciding to stay despite having every reason to leave. And I think the best answer that I can give is that there are some things in life that you run toward, and there are some things in life that you can't seem to run away from. And for me, faith is the latter kind of thing. It just chases me everywhere I go. I'm sure a lot of you probably are similar to this, right? If you could get away from it, maybe you would. There are plenty of other things you could be doing with your time this morning. For me, I also think that there's something really beautiful, particularly those of us who come from the queer community, when the very thing that hurt you becomes the very thing that begins to help heal you. You know, the Bible has a picture in the prophets of a sword being banged into a plowshare, of a tool of harm being transformed into a tool of healing. And that's been my experience of the church, and I think that's really beautiful.
Thank you.
We're still waiting for questions to come in. Jonathan, you can fill out a question card and then it'll come up. Yep. Jonathan, you mentioned the election at the beginning, and
yeah.
I know that's on a lot of people's mind this morning. How do we face our fears when it comes to the political climate in which we find ourselves?
Boy, that's a really easy question. Thank you for giving it to me. We're people of faith. I assume we're all people of faith because we're here and not somewhere else. And the best synonym for faith is trust. And I think particularly in election year, there's these questions of what you trust and do you trust and how can you trust. And so for me, I think that's the spiritual practice I keep coming back to when I can't see where this is going and I can't see where this is going. I incorporate that into my prayer practice, and I trust. Some of this, by the way, comes through remembering, and you're lucky because many of us in here, we have some city miles on us, right? So we can look back and we can review the tape. I think it's very interesting that at the center of the Christian tradition is a practice of remembering, because we're able to think back to all of the other times when we couldn't see where this was going. All of the other times. I hear people talk about, I wasn't alive, the duck and cover days, right? You can review the tape of these times of great fear and uncertainty when your boat made it to the other side. And I think that practice of remembrance can be really, really helpful. You can begin to remind yourself that you have a pattern of provision in your life. This is what happens with the Israelites. When you enter into that land, remember what the Lord your God did for you, how he brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remember what God has done so that when you're in that time of uncertainty, you can hold on to the past to give you confidence in the present.
Thank you. Remembrance and repentance. We have a card that simply says, as a straight person, I want to say I am sorry.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kind of thinking about, in relation to the election, one person asked, have you reconciled with your parents? And so I am curious about your personal relationship with your family, also with an awareness that your dad is a once president of the Southern Baptist Convention, like the opposite of the Episcopal Church in terms of the spectrum of Christianity. What does it look like to have conversations across difference? And is it even possible?
It is possible. Both sides have to be willing to do the work, right? And I'm actually lucky because my dad has been willing to do the work. But we have a smaller relationship than I would like. And that's, it's okay, but it's also sad. I remember seeing a therapist once, and we were talking actually about this. And she liked props, this therapist. So she went back to her cabinet and she got a piece of poster board and she threw it into the floor. And she said, this poster board represents all the ways you want to be loved by your parents. She went back into her desk and she pulled out a piece of notebook paper and she put the notebook paper in the middle and she said, and this piece of notebook paper represents all the ways they're capable of loving you. So you have a choice. You can spend the rest of your mortal life pulling that notebook paper and trying to stretch it to the end of that poster board, and it will never happen. In fact, you'll fray it and tear it up in the process and end up very frustrated. Or you can build the most beautiful thing that's possible in the borders of that notebook paper. And with all of the energy reserves you save from not tearing at that notebook paper, you can find ways to be loved outside of those borders. And that for me changed everything. And I began to focus on this little thing that we have, and it's not nothing. And it's quite beautiful in its own way, even though it's less than what I would wish for. Yeah.
Thanks.
How would you describe your faith life now? In what ways has your faith changed in the last 12 years?
Well, I'm not a fundamentalist anymore, so that's pretty helpful. It's a lot fewer stress.
You put the fun in fundamental.
Yes, that's right. I did. Yeah, that's right. So that's a big one. I think though what I often say about my faith evolution is my faith didn't evolve from being on the right to being on the left. It was an evolution from being closed to being open. It was really, I would say, more of a mystical journey than along a political or theological continuum. I'm much more interested these days in the mystery, the great mystery, mysterium tremendum, the great mystery that is God. I'm much more interested. My faith used to be centered on what I believed were the right answers. And now it's centered on what I believe are the right questions. And I think that's what faith does. I think faith is not some kind of certainty, some flashcard faith where we say we have all the right answers. Faith is a commitment to wrestling with the right questions all the days of our lives.
We have maybe 5 minutes left. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about your work as a journalist, which I know is part of what you do, and also as a children's book writer.
Yeah. Well, being a journalist was, somebody said that in the early days of my career, every time they read an article, they felt like it was a tiny act of patricide, which I thought was funny. That's murdering your father, for those of you who don't know. Because a lot of my work is based on the critique of bad religion. And I feel like that's been transforming in recent years. I'm so much less interested in battling with evangelicals and fundamentalists and all of the nasty forms of Christianity. I'm happy that some people do that. That can be important work. It's just not something that gives me life. Going back to Richard Rohr, he has a very famous quote where he says, "The best critique of the bad is the practice of the better." See, you all could go out today, instead of being here, you could put on sandwich boards and go down to the next evangelical church and march outside. But what you're doing here by bearing witness to a better way of being Christian, the practice of the better that happens at St. Bart's, that's the best critique of the bad. Because people can point and say, look, my goodness, look at what those people are doing. That is hope, that is love, that is faith, that is kindness, that's inclusion, that's acceptance, and that's beautiful. Being a children's author is a really unique thing, especially in this time, because the very types of stories that we need to tell, stories of inclusion like this one, these are the types of stories that make people the most afraid these days. And they're under attack. That's one of the reasons why I love coming to places and selling books, because that's how inclusive stories get out into the world. That's how you prove to publishers that these stories matter, that they should exist. That's why I say, buy books for your friends. Buy gifts of these books, because these stories, the future that we will create is largely a function of the stories we choose to tell our children. And we can continue to tell them stories of fear and division and hatred and bigotry, or we can tell them stories of courage and kindness and compassion and love. And I'm committed to telling the second kind of stories.
Thank you so much. In closing, and to piggyback off that, tell us a little bit specifically about the origin of My Guncle and Me, and the inspiration behind it, and how generally would you say we can help young children be compassionate to themselves and other children as they explore their sexuality?
Well, the gift of storytelling is an act of formation of imagination. And so, I grew up in a world that I didn't have an imagination for what it looked like to be who I am today, and I had to sort of form that on the fly in adulthood. So what I hope we do with a book like this, is that we give another generation imagination. But the thing is, and it's sort of weird, adults love this book. They weep when they read this book. And I often say children's books, the gift of children's books for kids is that it teaches them things we hope they'll never forget. The gift of children's books for grown-ups like us is that it reminds us of things we've forgotten. And there's a message in this book that we have to continually remind ourselves of. This book is a story about a kid named Henry and his fabulous guncle, who shows up. Henry is sort of struggles with the ways that he's different, the way that he doesn't conform, the way that he doesn't think he measures up to other people, the way that he feels left out or rejected. And his guncle shows up and takes him on an adventure and reminds him that what makes him different makes him special. I devoted this book in the inscription to Mr. Rogers. Some of you maybe. Mr. Rogers was maybe a surrogate father to you as well. And for someone like me, you can't understand the impact it had growing up in a home like mine, to turn on the television set and every day have this man look at you and say, you make this day a special day by just your being you. There's nobody in this whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. That's really the message of this book. And in lieu of having Mr. Rogers come to our television set, I hope that this book will give that message from bookshelves all across America.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your honesty, your candor, your wisdom, and your wit, and for sharing with us a message of hope and love this day. We have been so blessed by your presence and pray God's blessing as you go forth.
Thank you.
So as Zach mentioned, if you're here in person, there are books in the back, My Guncle and Me. We also have Learning to Speak God from Scratch, so Tegan has them, and you can buy them right here in the Great Hall. We hope you'll be back next week as we welcome Father James Martin, Jesuit priest and author, to speak with us.